Hello. Welcome to another episode of Ancient Office Hours by the Ozymandias Project. Trireme Transit is now boarding for all new and returning passengers. Now departing, present ponderings. Next stop is Ancient Office Hours at a library lost in the sands of time.
Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 43 of Ancient Office Hours. This week, I spoke with Dr. Felipe Rojas Silva, a professor of archaeology at Brown University. His book, The Pasts of Roman Anatolia, Interpreters, Traces, Horizons, examines Roman period manipulations of Bronze and Iron Age material remains in what is now Turkey. He has conducted archaeological fieldwork in Turkey and Jordan, and is the co-director of the Petra Traces Archaeological Project, and was the associate director of the Notion Archaeological Survey. We spoke about his career switch from architecture to archaeology, research in humans marveling at ancient ruins, and interest in sense memory using smell. I hope you enjoy this episode, and if you like what you hear, please give us a 5-star rating and review us on Apple or Spotify. You can also subscribe to our Patreon, as this will allow us to reach more people and make more exciting ancient world content. Enjoy! Thank you so much for joining me today. I was really excited to have this conversation. It's a long time coming. I know I emailed you a while ago. So I want to get right into things and ask you a little bit about how you got into the ancient world. Like, what drew you in? Because I find it such a unique story and there is no one right way. Was it like a general love of the ancient world? Was it a class that was like an Egyptian class and you're like, I love Egypt, or a classics course? I just love this.
I was born in Colombia and I grew up in Colombia. I was originally trained as an architect. And when I was studying architecture, I began learning ancient languages. And I liked learning ancient languages a lot. And after I had finished my degree in architecture, for various reasons, I wanted to leave Colombia. And I applied to a grad school where there was somebody who was very interested in Greek and Roman architecture, and was partly interested in me because of my abilities to draw. And so after my first year of grad school, I went to Turkey as an architectural draftsman to work in the city of Aphrodisias. And I think my love of ancient languages was coupled at that moment with my love for Turkey, or going to Aphrodisias really made a huge impact on my life. I enjoyed being there a lot. I enjoyed the sort of work that I was doing there. It was very different from everything else I had done. I enjoyed the challenges of learning Turkish. So I think it was those two things. I was interested in ancient languages, and then going to Turkey sort of really focused my energies, if that's the right expression.
Yeah, I think that sounds really interesting. I love the background in architecture. It's something that's, it's related, but it's still a little non-traditional. And so I see that you do both Egyptology and Assyriology. So is it like
I don't do either of those things. So I have 2 appointments at Brown because of sort of administrative reasons. I am mostly at the Tchaikovsky Institute for Archaeology, and okay. I am also my other home base, as it were, is the Department of Egyptology and Assyriology, and in that department, I mostly in charge of things Hittite. So I'm not an Assyriologist, I'm not an Egyptologist, but I do know about the Hittites, and so that's sort of my commitment to that department is Hittite matters.
Okay. Well, that shows how much you can learn from reading up on someone's website bio on university sites. So since that's obviously not super accurate on the website, then this is a great opportunity then to say, what would you categorize your specific interests and specific research in, and how did you curate that interest? Like, what led you to that specific work?
Well, I have lots of overlapping interests or even independent interests, but let me start with where I was just at. So with my interest in architecture, when I first went to Turkey, I was interested, or rather, I was made to work on Roman monumental architecture. Aphrodisia is a very well preserved city. There are many monuments that are in very good shape, and I worked for a while on domestic late antique residences, and by work I mean I drew them. And later on, I worked on an imperial temple or an imperial temple complex in Aphrodisias. And I initially just drew them. Eventually, I got to think about how those buildings were put together. Those questions about monumental architecture, I kept exploring in different sites in Turkey. I worked also for many years at Sardis, in the city of Sardis. And there, again, I worked on a very big temple, the Temple of Artemis at Sardis, and also in different parts of the city. That interest in drawing the sort of ancient material culture has continued, and I've continued to do that in the field. And I think some of my questions have I guess expanded about and have now turned onto human landscape interaction in different parts of the ancient world. I now work also in Petra, Jordan, and I'm very interested in the agricultural, or let's say the suburban terracing systems that control water and earth around the city of Petra. So my interest in the built environment has moved from monumental architecture to questions about human landscape interaction. While I was working, especially at Sardis, I was excavating in Sardis for almost a decade, and I became very interested in the fact that the periodizations with which we approach the ancient world are in some ways artificial impositions on the world. And so I came across material objects that were out of place. And by this, I mean, in digging a Roman temple in Sardis, I came across a Bronze Age mace head, for example, that attracted my attention a lot. And I began to wonder, well, how does a person in Roman Sardis interact with a Bronze Age mace head? As I was traveling throughout Turkey, I became really interested in Hittite and later rock reliefs carved in the cliffs and mountains of Turkey. There are many of these things. And the same question sort of popped up. What does a Greek or Roman observer think about these ancient monuments that are highly conspicuous, they're not ubiquitous, but there's hundreds of these things. And so there's no doubt that people saw them. And I was interested in trying to figure out how an ancient observer made sense of this material. That question sort of was a central question for my dissertation, and much of my work has centered on what you could call the archaeology of memory, or the investigation of the past in the past. I have different terms for it. I think that what we're seeing in some of those engagements of ancient interpreters with even more ancient evidence is what I call archaeophilia, which is a human impulse to make history out of material objects. And that is a really central part of my academic work. And then I'm also interested in comparative ideas of history and comparative ideas of archaeology and comparative ideas of antiquarianism. And so I have sort of made an effort to engage in dialogue with people working on similar matters in other parts of the world, especially in the Americas, and also in sort of Turkey and Armenia and sort of neighboring regions. So I'm interested in comparative antiquarian practice.
That is something that I find fascinating, but I've never had the opportunity to really get into, just with the way my studies and my schedule came out. I just didn't really get into it. So I think it's awesome so all this to say, I think it's awesome that you're really sort of taking on this amazing endeavor, really, that I don't think a lot of people would be very aware of or know that it is a discipline in which they could kind of go further. I would say the only thing close that I have heard of was a good friend of mine is a Greek archaeologist, and he loves roof tiles. He loves studying roof tiles, and he loves studying where ancient Greek and Roman roof tiles end up, because he would talk about, we find roof tiles everywhere, and he's like, well, how did this get here when it's not supposed, we wouldn't think it was here. So that's just sort of the bare bones of how he explained it. I don't remember exactly, but it sounds really interesting, and I'd love to learn more about it. But I want to just rewind really quickly to when you were younger and up and coming as a person and as a scholar. So you said you were originally from Colombia. So was there any emphasis placed on the sort of study of the cultural history from South America, from that region of the world, and in your personal family life, school even? And did you always have a fascination with, I guess, the Mediterranean, or did you ever think maybe you would want to go into the architecture and the archaeology of South America?
So it's two different questions. One is about the history of South America, and the other one is about my interest in the Mediterranean.
It could be interpreted as two questions like that, but I guess it's, when you grew up just in your family, was there an emphasis on, studying the culture from where you have come? And I guess the two-parter would be then, yes, did you ever want to study South American culture, or were you always just, no, I know I would like to go to the Mediterranean?
I understand the question. So I mean, I can answer kind of anecdotally about my own experience. I think there in the school that I went to, and I went to the same school from when I was 6 to when I was 18, there was very little emphasis on any history. History was just not something that was very important. I think the sciences were much more important, and there was a huge emphasis on that, and then on literature. But there was really minimal attempts at teaching any history. So I don't think that's very unusual in Colombia. I may be wrong, and I'm sure there are other people whose experiences have much richer sort of historical pedagogy. Mine was really terrible. I think there is minimal awareness among Colombians, including me, about the sort of archaeology and history, especially the pre-colonial history of the country. But there are a few sites that are known to everybody. I think it's not very different from what happens in the US, perhaps with a little bit more emphasis on the pre-Columbian cultures in Colombia, but it's basically analogous to what happens in the US, that people aren't really very deeply educated in the pre-contact history of the land. I had no interest in particular in the Mediterranean. I mean, I had been there before I started studying classics, but I wasn't particularly interested. And I think had I learned different languages, I may have been interested in other parts of the world, but I happened to learn Greek and Latin, and so I ended up, and I went to Aphrodisias, and so I ended up there. But I think my fascination with the ancient world is pretty late. I mean, I think I was 25 or something before I really said, well, okay, I can dedicate my life to this part of the world. And as I say, I think Turkey was really important. It made a huge impact on me to be there, to meet people, to learn the language, to live there. It just opened my eyes to things that I really value.
Okay. So you just mentioned that there was really no emphasis on the teaching of history, and especially archaeology, with the focus being on science, which unfortunately is a trend I see us kind of going back to, especially in the US, but also around the world, where we're emphasizing STEM and we're defunding humanities programs left and right, just because it's kind of prioritizing resources. And unfortunately, we're always on the chopping block. So because of that situation, because humanities and history aren't deemed sort of worthy enough of getting the funding, did you or maybe your family ever have, serious doubts about you choosing this subject as a career? I mean, were you I know your early interest was in architecture, and that is different, obviously. But also, I would argue that a lot of parents of today would say, well, architecture really won't make you a lot of money either. So, was there ever a push for you to get into some sort of STEM field so you could make, like, I guess whatever people would assume would be like a lot of money and be more financially secure? Or were you quite supported in going into the arts, really?
I think my family was completely supportive, and I received no pushback, and I think the same is true for my siblings, that people just did what they wanted to, and you would sort of figure it out. I think there was a little bit of pushback from the institutions themselves when I went to college. I think people, and I remember a conversation. I did very well on my standardized test, and I remember somebody saying, "You can do better than this. You should actually become an engineer or something. There's hope for you." But I received very little. I mean, no pushback, just basically support from my family, and yeah.
Well, I would say that that's a great advantage, at least to have the family support, because I unfortunately know too many people who butt heads with their parents who say, I want to do this. And they say, no, you are not allowed to do that. You have to go be an accountant and make money so then you can come off our payroll or something very similar.
Yeah, I think part of the issue, I finished college in the year 2000, which wasn't the best time to finish college in Colombia. And I think a lot of people in many fields, in many disciplines, especially in architecture, but in other disciplines as well, didn't have a very clear path forward. I think very few of my classmates who studied architecture became architects. And I think that's true in other disciplines. So I mean, it would be hard to give pushback, because it's not like there were that many jobs anyway. I think that helped maybe.
It might have. I mean, it's trying to theorize and figure out. Might be a little hard, but I can imagine where it would be. Yeah, yeah. So I'm trying to go back to where you mentioned sort of doing the archaeology of memory in the senses, and I kind of just wanted to dive back into that. So, do you mind elaborating a little further on kind of what you hope to explore within that, just for people who didn't know or who do not know what on earth that means? Because I'm betting that most of my audience, and myself included, go, oh, that sounds really cool, but I don't really know what that means, because how can you equate senses and things to something as broad as archaeology?
Yeah. So I came in the wake of sort of seminal academic contributions to the topic, and I think around the turn of the millennium, maybe 2003, 2002, there were several books that really transformed the field and pushed the possibilities of exploring these seemingly intangible aspects of life, like memory. I'm thinking in particular of two books of Richard Bradley, The Past in Prehistoric Societies, and Sue Alcock's Archaeologies of the Greek Past. So both those books are really sort of game-changing. And what they did was to sort of demonstrate that you could study how people came together around things and, in a way, interacted and manipulated the past by using things and just interacting with them. So what I was interested in was a little bit more specific, which was, what did the classical, let's say, civilizations, so the Greeks and Romans, think and do with Bronze Age material culture? And that is a big question, because people often assume that there's a very big break between the Bronze Age and let's say the Iron Age, a break that in Greece, for example, results in the forgetting of writing. So the linear writing systems of the Aegean are ceased to be used for centuries, and writing sort of resurges as an alphabetic writing much later. And so I was interested in thinking, well, what did Herodotus and his contemporaries think of the fortresses of the Hittites, or what did the poets who wrote the Homeric epics think of weapons that you would find when you dug, or as I said, what did just anybody, normal people, think about those reliefs that are so conspicuous and that have writing, and that have writing that is conspicuously writing, even if you can't read it when you see a cuneiform inscription. Almost everybody would know, almost everybody has interacted with writing would think, well, that could be writing. And so my questions had to do with what did that stuff that for us is from the Bronze and Iron Age mean to Greeks and Romans. And so initially when I started working on this, my advisor, whom I love dearly, said, there's not enough stuff. This is really interesting. It's a really cool question, but you'll never find enough stuff to write a dissertation. And I think by the end of the dissertation, I had so much stuff that it was hard to write the dissertation because there was too much. And so I think that without those seminal books, I wouldn't have engaged in the project. And then again, sort of support from the people around me made it possible to engage in a project that initially seemed tenuous and improbable, and later on sort of just became a huge project.
Okay, I thank you for clearing that up, because now I have a better picture of what your the heart of your inquiries were. And it is very helpful to imagine, okay, so we have, we have Pericles, we have someone in the 5th century, we maybe have people in the 4th century looking back at these historical artifacts that we have and just saying, what on earth is this? And so as you were describing that, it got me thinking. And it's the funniest thing. I was trying to think of sort of modern examples and portrayals we have of ourselves. And what I mean, I guess, is just modern people portrayed in culture, looking back at our past and also wondering about things that are ancient. And I guess I love doing this sort of little media section where I say, is there like a sort of media portrayal, whether it's in a film or TV show, that takes sort of this question of looking at the past and really wondering, what did people do? How did this come here? What did this do? And like, is there something that kind of we can look at and say, oh, that's sort of portraying the question that you've had in your mind. So as you were describing kind of like, what would Herodotus think of, the Cycladic, remnants from the Bronze Age? I was thinking, oh, it's kind of like Planet of the Apes, right? Where we have people looking at the ruins of our civilization way in the future thinking, oh, who built these? Why are these here? And then I pictured the very iconic Statue of Liberty buried in the sand, and them just kind of coming across it and going, oh my goodness. So that's just one example, obviously. But are there other?
It's a very good example.
But are there other good ones that you have been able to sort of see or notice and say, oh, I really like this. Can we go deeper?
I mean, from the top of my head, I can't think of one. I might something might pop up, but I think that's a very good example. It's I'm interested in people recognizing objects as man-made, and then not only as man-made, but as old and man-made, and then explaining how they got there. That's sort of what I'm interested in. And I don't know, often movies about extraterrestrials sometimes have this moment of arriving in a planet, whether it's this one or a different planet, and seeing traces of a human or humanoid past, and then from the traces coming up with a story about how they got there and why they are the way they are. So I think it's a common trope. I think it's weirdly unusual, or it was weirdly unusual until recently, for people to think that about really sort of ancient people. So for people to think, well, the Greeks were engaged in this and the Assyrians were engaged in this, and presumably people in the Neolithic were engaged in this, and perhaps people in the Paleolithic were also engaged in this, that awareness that there is man-made stuff and that man-made stuff can be explained because you have different ways of interacting with that stuff and extrapolating historical evidence from it.
Well, I think that even you just walking us through that again just popped another example into my mind, and now I have to ask: have you seen the Alien sequel, Alien versus Predator? Have you seen that movie?
I have not, but I know that it has an interesting script. I know that I haven't. Tell me more.
So what you're describing from your interest got me thinking, I think you'd really enjoy it because we have in that particular movie a bunch of people who encounter this pyramid hidden way deep in like Antarctica. And there's actually a character who I think he might actually have been like from Colombia. I don't know if it's Colombia, but there's a character from South America, and he's an archaeologist, and he looks at pyramids. And then there's this very specific scene that I'm thinking of where he talks through our main character and says, "Oh yes, we've found this very strange pyramid that looks like it's modeled after pyramids from 3 different ancient civilizations. What is it doing in Antarctica? Oh my goodness." And he's like, "And it predates the old ones. We need to go look at this. We need to figure out why." And then, that's basically the premise of the movie, which is you have to go explore this old pyramid, which predates all the pyramids that we've found. And so, oh my gosh, that just like popped into my mind. And I'm like,
that's good example. Another good example.
So I'm like, oh my gosh, wait, that's too bad. They should have hired you for the movie, for the role. and then you could have had some fun pretending to analyze an alien pyramid that holds an alien from outer space and a predator in a spaceship. But okay, so I have some other questions that I would like to ask. And the first is, when you were a young student in college, did you attend office hours?
No, I mean, there weren't any, so I didn't.
Okay. So second question would be, if they had been offered / from knowing what you do now as a professor, why should students go to office hours?
I mean, I had a different sort of academic education, and in some ways it was more informal, and there's much less prestige attached to being a college professor in Colombia, if you can imagine that, than there is in the US. And I think the relationships are in some ways more informal. And so there's no need for office hours because you sort of have many opportunities to interact with your instructors and your professors. And I think the good thing is that you get to understand what motivates them, I think, quite well by just being around people and talking to them and having lunch with them and having coffee with them. And so that's I think an advantage of understanding what it is that makes people tick.
Oh, I love that. And since the emphasis is completely different, would you mind elaborating a little on the differences sort of in system? Because I think most American college students can't really imagine other things other than, no, don't you just go to class and then they have a time so you can go talk and sort of get extra help if they missed a class or they need a clarification. That's usually, I think, what we think of and what we're used to. So I know to a lot of Americans, the idea of sort of hanging out with professors is very foreign and weird. So just what was it like?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think the social structures were slightly different. And so when I was in college, a lot of my time was spent in studio, and there were these very long, there weren't classes, it was just time in a big room, but it was a lot of time. It was 6 hours or 8 hours when like that you had to be there, and then people stayed there for many more hours. And so I think just spending 8 hours or 10 hours in the same sort of space with other people, you just have to interact almost by necessity. And in my experience, these sort of more creative fields, there's a lot of collaboration. So if you're tired or if you didn't finish your plans, and somebody would come help you. And in my experience, at least, the teachers were often part of the process. They really, or at least some of them, the ones that I gravitated towards, helped. And as you advance through your degree, you ended up working for some of these people professionally. And so I think the boundaries were more porous, that you sometimes were their employee, sometimes you were their student, sometimes you were maybe not their friend, but their, I don't know, their close acquaintance, let's say.
Sure. And what, in terms of, I mean, okay, this could turn into a very large question, and it may not have an answer, but I find your research very fascinating. I found the question fascinating. And what would be the next frontier, the next big thing you would like to see within the archaeology of sense memory? And what is something that you feel would really propel us to the next step? So, like, what's the next logical question we would be asking, and that would be of interest to research?
Yeah. There are two projects that I'm engaged in right now that I think are exciting and that I hope other people find exciting. This effort of mine to understand how people engage with the past has led me to sort of try to find different ways of doing so, different ways of telling stories about the past. So I concentrated initially on monuments, on fortresses, on rock reliefs, on sort of buildings. But through that effort, I then started thinking, well, what about other forms of accessing the past? And I've written, for example, about smell as a way of accessing the past. And so people will, I mean, the classic example of sort of senses in the past is in Proust and his Madeleine. But I wrote about people in Greek and Roman antiquity smelling events, specific events in the past. So smelling, for example, the fact that a centaur had died in a specific place, and the smell was recurrent, and the smell could be accessed by either experts or just the general population, and it would be attributed to the death of a centaur. This interest in the archaeology of the senses, I think, intersects with people who have been doing this longer than I have, including my colleague Yannis Hamilakis and other people around the Mediterranean. What's at stake, I think, is varieties of historical consciousness, varieties of human ways of thinking about the past, and not just thinking about the past, but accessing it and manipulating it and reinventing. And so I'm now engaged in a project that concerns dance, ancient performance as a way of making history. And we know from both textual and evidence and actually material evidence that this happened, and this happens cross-culturally in other places, that history is not just written or not just, say, monumentalized with marble. It can also be sort of relived in embodied fashion, not simply as a sort of festival, but as an expert manner of sophisticated engagement with specific past. And so that's one of the things that I'm interested in doing right now, is exploring dance as history in the Roman East. And then the other thing that I'm really interested in is, you could call it sort of the transformations of classical traditions in different parts of the world. I'm particularly interested in Central Mexico, and I'm interested in sort of the ways that Aztec, or rather Nahua intellectuals and Nahua peoples both imagined their own past and then somehow had to fit it into Christian ideas of the past. Again, they're all questions about historical consciousness, about communitive memory, and about how you find the past in things in different ways, either through smell or through dance, or just by looking at ruins in the way, more or less, that archaeologists do now.
Wow. Okay. So through smell, I that just sort of triggered something in me, which was So when it's just say, for an example, I were to pick up a piece of jewelry that my grandmother wore, and I were to smell it and I still smelled her perfume, do you consider that like a still way of almost accessing the past through sort of just being able to sort of smell the perfume and be like, oh, this is what this is her perfume, this is what she smelled like. So then, would that, if it triggered some sort of memory of remembering something she did or whatever, is that something kind of what you're going for, but just more ancient than like me smelling my grandmother's perfume?
So there are several things in the example. I mean, you're smelling your grandmother's perfume is a way for you to access the past, but it's quite personal and it's quite limited. If I were to smell that piece of clothing or whatever, I almost certainly wouldn't be able to decode what you decode unless you sort of tell me. I'm interested in sort of collective versions of that. And I think in the Western tradition, which is kind of I'm sort of brutally homogenizing here, but in sort of European history, smell hasn't been super important for historical thinking. But there are communities in the world among whom smell is a much richer code of communicating information, including historical information. And so your example is good at a personal level, and from there you could imagine, well, what if we all, or a community of us, agreed that smell is valuable because it encodes whatever the smell of an important person. Then the other thing that is important here is that I would dare to say, are probably not an expert sort of smeller, but there are communities in which there are expert smellers, and among us, of course, sommeliers or chefs have sort of a very sophisticated sense of smell. In the ancient world and contemporary communities as well, there were similar experts, and so there are sort of anecdotal and almost jocular pieces of evidence that suggest that there were connoisseurs who could smell the specific smell of Corinthian bronzes and could tell real Corinthian bronzes from fake Corinthian bronzes by smelling. I'm not sure that was the case, but that's the sort of thing that I'm interested in. People with sort of advanced capabilities of smelling who other people recognize as experts. So communities of people who say, well, that person really knows how to smell the past. So I think those two things. One is a community-wide agreement, and then these expert interpreters of smell.
Okay, so when you said community, so then I think my brain automatically jumped to, so in some cultures, maybe where not one person like my grandmother, but maybe like a task or a job that was particularly important to the survival of the community as a whole. So now I'm thinking of, I think I saw like a 60 minutes documentary on like falconeering in Mongolia being essential to living and being able to survive in this hostile environment. So even like smelling a hawk, because that's what you use to go falconeering, and that's how the culture survived. So was that more the community type of, if everyone smelled a hawk and knew that this was how they got their food to survive, so they related it clearly to the cultural, this is our like sport, but also our survival. Is that more the community that you're thinking?
I think that's more the community. I mean, it's there are and there have been communities that have very rich ways of experiencing smell sensations and of sharing sort of olfactory sensations, including communities in Colombia that have been well studied, that have these vast, for example, vocabularies of smell, which we don't have. Our own vocabularies of smell are in some ways limited. It's hard to agree on what exactly is a smell, or hard to pin. If I tell you a smell, it may not be the same smell that I'm thinking about. Whereas there have been people who have well, vocabularies, but as I say, sort of lived experiences that are much more sort of olfactory centered, and I'm interested in part in how some of these people use smell to produce history.
Well, I just find it fascinating, and just even getting the time to ask and sort of really delve into this fascinating topic that I really didn't know was a thing, in all honesty, has been so wonderful. And I wish that I could pick your brain about it for, 10 more hours. But I do understand that we both have, actual lives and can't spend 10 hours. So, the final thing that I have my guests do on each podcast is I ask if each guest would read Percy Shelley's Ozymandias. And then after reading it, if you could just give us your quick thoughts on, what is the meaning of this poem? Like, why is it important, and what lessons might we take from this very impactful thing? And I think hearing from you on it, considering your background and expertise on monumental architecture, would lends very well to this question.
Yeah. All right. Let me give it a try. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed." And on the pedestal, these words appear: "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing besides remain. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." What does this mean to me? This could be the epigraph of most of my academic work. I have tried to explore and explain and reflect about how people have looked at man-made things and at the changes they undergo, and how people have tried to connect matter and time. And I have tried also to suggest and to show that archaeology is a very recent and academically authoritative expression of a human impulse that is very old, that is thousands and thousands of years old, which is the impulse to understand things that are recognized as man-made things, the impulse to try to make sense of matter that has been manipulated by man. That's what I think it means.
Yeah, I love that. I love it. And just considering the fantastic discussion we were having about this, basically, it hits differently, I think, today. I don't know. I read this all the time, so I don't know if I'm like desensitized to it, or no, I'm kidding. I love it, and it hits differently every time. But so one of the things that I often say is that, yes, it is talking about like a literal statue in the sand. It's talking about a forgotten civilization, but also I believe that it is an incredibly political statement by Shelley on the nature of the ephemeral nature of power, political power. It's kind of a memento mori, hey, we're going to die, guys. And also just the fleeting nature of things that we thought were like amazing and great, and we thought we were going to last for all time. That's not really true. And so kind of in light of thinking about it that way, the last question I like to ask every guest is, if we consider today's culture and society and just kind of where we are in life in the world, what is something in our current society that we think also is monumental and great and amazing that might last forever? And whatever that may be, realistically, in 1,000 years, well, okay, if climate change kills us all, that's being generous. So let's just say like 200 years. But in 200 years, will that current thing that we think is amazing and will last forever actually still be around? Or will we look back at ourselves and just say, what on earth were we thinking? This was so stupid. Like, just what were we doing?
I mean, I think partly because of coronavirus, but partly for more general reasons, we're increasingly aware of the fragility of our own institutions and our own ways of being. And I think the most lasting traces of ourselves will be things that we're not thinking about all the time. So toothbrushes and garbage bags and toys and plastic and all that stuff that just lasts and lasts and lasts. I think the Shelley poem is interesting and it's beautiful, but it's very Eurocentric in a way. These types of monuments, the big statues, the big fortresses, the reliefs on the mountains, are peculiar forms of memory making, and other people have different forms of memory making that are long lasting, but lasting in different ways. And our songs and our poems and our ways of interacting with plants and with rivers and mountains that are for us almost invisible, but we're not considered invisible, and we're considered long lasting, and we're considered to be not just the case, but the case forever. And yet there's almost no trace of that. And for us who are slightly blind to these things, they're very hard to recognize in the world. Different forms of memory making are hard to recognize for us, but plastic will be remembered.
Unfortunately, I think you're right, especially with the rate that plastic things are getting stuck in our oceans and we're finding them in weird spots. And we're like, how did this get here? Oh my gosh, that's a little concerning. I would definitely agree with you there. And I find it so interesting that you did bring up that it's taking a very Eurocentric point of view. I didn't think about that because Shelley himself is British. He's talking about the statue, which, yes, it's based off of the statue of Ramesses, but the statue itself was being moved to like the British Museum. And in the UK, I mean, we see kind of the monuments that are left over there and how the Egyptians also favored monumental architecture. But it's very true. I hadn't thought about there are a lot of other cultures that their own ways would not be to just build a bunch of monuments, which is why also I think, unfortunately, today when we do observe cultures that maybe didn't leave such lasting structures or the remnants of lasting structures, we tend to think, oh, well, they didn't really have anything then because they don't have anything. But that's just not true. It's just in a different form. That is a take wow, just like I've not heard anything close to that. And I love it. And I love how it relates so well to the rest of our discussion. And again, oh my gosh, I think I've run out of wonderful things to say about it. So thank you so much for joining me. I was so excited to speak to you. And I mean, I certainly have had a really good time because I feel like I learned a lot. So
thank you, Lexie. I enjoyed this a lot too.
Great, thank you.
Trireme Transit is now departing ancient office hours. Next stop is Present Ponderings.